Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. So I saw a real interesting post on Woodland Mills Facebook group the other day talking about lubrication for the sawmill blade, whether it's needed, how important it is, and I thought this would be a really interesting topic for a video. By the way, if you have any topics you think would make for a good video, please let me know. I'm always looking for new ideas about videos. But the topic of blade lubrication to me is kind of an important one. And it was interesting to see the replies. They range from, yes, you absolutely have to use it, to no, I don't use any. And then there were some people giving data about how things perform. And what I realized is a lot of folks are kind of missing really the key point of using blade lubrication. And to really understand that, you kind of have to think about the long-term implications of running with and without lubrication. Now, in terms of a bandsaw mill, and this is true of a lot of types of saws and cutting tools, but specifically in terms of a bandsaw mill, the real point of running lubrication onto the blade is to help keep it cool as it passes through the wood, as it's in that cut. And it turns out, you know, if you were to run your sawmill through a log and cut up a bunch of boards, then come over and feel the blade, you know, it'll be warm to the touch. If you're using lubricant keeping things cool, it's not going to be really hot. And you might think, well, it's not getting that warm, what's the big deal? But in terms of what happens to the blade and what happens to the metal, this is carbon steel. It's treated in a way that makes it springy. It makes it resilient to lots of turns and passes through, you know, around the wheels here through the mill. And it's something that you're going to want to sharpen over and over and reuse as many times as possible. So in terms of the metal of the blade and your goals to keep a sharp blade and to resharpen the blade and to reuse it, lubricant is important in the sense that it minimizes the thermal cycles and the wear and tear on the blade. And so you don't want to think about this in terms of, hey, my blade doesn't feel that hot after I saw a log. Really, you want to think about the long term. You know, how long am I going to keep this blade? How many times do I want to resharpen it? How much use and life do I want to get out of this blade? And when you think about it over that long term, then lubricant and coolant becomes very important. And so I want to kind of step through the logic here, maybe build this up in a thought process way that everybody can understand. And so what happens in terms of the fatigue and the cycles you're putting on this blade? You know, some of it happens just by the fact that you're turning it around a set of tensioned pulleys and it's following a certain shape, and every time you do that, it puts that blade through a cycle. But in terms of wear and tear from cutting, really all that happens down here as this blade passes through the log. As it's cutting through the wood, it's creating friction that creates heat. There's an abrasiveness, there's wear happening. So you have both mechanical issues and you have thermal issues affecting the metal of this blade as it passes through the log. On a simple scale, you know, the lubricant is going to help that blade slide through that log, through the wood easier. It's going to put a thin film of lubricant between the metal of the blade and the fibers of the wood. And you know, that's going to reduce just mechanical wear, but also heat. And so, you know, in a very basic sense, that's what the lubricant is doing for you as the blade is passing through the wood. And so that's kind of a very local scale. Just picture, you know, if you're riding on this blade, you know, you're going to go through a pretty intense process as you enter the wood, pass through it, and then come out the other end. And that's where lubricant has its local effect. But to extrapolate that out to the long-term effect that really impacts the life of the blade, you kind of have to think bigger. And so I was just working through some of the math here. It's pretty interesting. So on Woodland Mills, sawmills, these Kohler engines, they make their peak horsepower right around 4,000 RPM. So if you take, you know, 4,000 is a nice round number. Let's take 4,000 and you work it through the ratio of the drive pulley on the clutch here to the drive wheel where it's going to slow down because this gets bigger. And then you look at the speed of the blade. For my HM122, this particular blade ends up moving at about 63 feet per second. That's about 43 miles per hour. And it's a 125 inch blade. So if you just want to time a full revolution of the blade, it's about 0.165 seconds. Okay, so every 0.165 seconds, this blade is making a full revolution. And so if you just want to consider, 1 point on the blade, every 0.165 seconds, it's coming through and entering the wood and going through that cutting process, then coming out the other side where it gets its primary wear and tear from sawing action. Okay, and so if you want to extrapolate that out a little bit further, what I did was I looked at some of my older videos and I timed how long it took me to saw through an average 12-foot long log. And for me, really the bulk of what I cut are logs around 14-inch diameter, 12 feet long. I do longer, I do shorter, I do other sizes, but a very average log for me is a 14-inch diameter, about 12 foot long. And if you look through the process of squaring up that size log and then cutting it into 1-inch thick boards, all of those cuts are about the same in terms of how much wood you're going to go through just for that particular size. I was averaging anywhere from 35 to about 45 seconds to make each of those cuts. So if I know how long it takes for the blade to go around, I know how long it takes per cut. For me to go through a 12-foot long 14-inch log and slice it into 1-inch boards, each point on this blade is going to make over 3,800 passes around as we break that log down into lumber. Okay, and so that's where you got to start thinking of this cumulative effect of wear and tear. It's not just what happens as the blade passes through the wood and gets mechanical wear and thermal fatigue from friction. It's the fact that you're doing this thousands of times for every log. And so in this case it's almost 4,000 times for an average log for me. And then you think, well, I do maybe 4 logs a day, and I might do it a couple days a week. You're looking at this blade, and the time it takes me to wear out this blade, it's making 40, 50,000, 60,000, 70,000 passes through wood. Okay, and that's where the effect of lubrication really comes into play long term. With anything mechanical, you don't want to just look at the local effects. You want to think about the cycles you put on it, the overall use, the time on it. When we talk about engines, we talk about RPM and engine time and engine hours. Similar thing here, only in terms of the friction, it's really how many passes this blade makes in the course of your usage before you want to take it off and resharpen it. And then long term, how many times can you resharpen it? At some point it's going to break just because the metal has fatigued. And so all of that comes into play when you're talking about lubrication. So that leads up to my answer that yes, lubrication is very important. It may not seem like it's doing much per cut or per log, but when you look at the life of a blade, the amount of sawing you do with the blade, lubrication for sure is going to be very, very important to extend the life out of these blades. And I don't know about anyone else, I think I'm paying $10 to $15 per blade. If I send it out for sharpening, it's anywhere from $5 to $8 usually. That all fluctuates, but blades are a big investment. And I believe I have 15 to 20 blades that I keep in rotation. I have a stack of dull ones that need to go out for sharpening. I have a stack of fresh ones, so I can always swap in a new blade. So for me, there's a big investment in blades. To me, it's on the scale of the sawmill itself. It's a lot of money. Blades are important. So to really extend the life of your blades, I think it's super important to run lubricant. Just think about that long-term game and getting your value, getting the maximum life out of these blades, beyond just the simple cutting performance of what happens from point A to point B where it's going through the wood. So yes, I think it's super important. I think you need to keep your eye on the long game here to understand why it's important. Now we can talk about the types of lubricant you could use. I'm trying to think. I've been sawing probably 20, 30 years if you count going back to the first time I even played with the sawmill. And I've seen all kinds of lubricant used in that time. I've seen people use diesel, kerosene. A lot of people use water. A lot of people use water with soap in it. Out here, I've been using windshield washer fluid. It works so well. I don't have to worry about freezing temperatures. So I use that year round. In the summer, I might throw some water in there when I know it's not going to be freezing. But just in general, I use the windshield washer fluid. It's worked great for me. If you're thinking about using something like diesel, any petroleum product, any product that's has any solvent properties or oily product properties, I want to caution you not to do that on the Woodland Mills units, because these guys, they use a belt for the running surface of the drive wheel, and then of course you have another belt over here in the follower wheel. These belts will not take kindly to stuff like diesel or kerosene. You know, over a period of time, you're going to deteriorate the belts, and I just do not think it's advisable to run anything like that. The Woodland Mills units, or really any sawmill that uses belts for the running surface of the blades. But there's many other sawmills. I'm thinking of one in particular, Cook's sawmills. They make a really nice sawmill. They have solid metal drive and follower wheels. They don't have any belts or any rubber inserts or anything. Their blades are running directly on metal. For a mill like that, sure, you can pretty much use anything. Diesel is a very attractive lubricant for that kind of a mill. You don't have to worry about deteriorating anything. And the diesel, and I'm trying to think, over the years, I've seen 2 mills where they use diesel. You can get by with a very, very low drip rate with diesel because it stays on the blade. It cuts through sap and pitch extremely well. And so you can be very frugal if you're using diesel as your lubricant. In fact, a lot of those mills, they don't drip it on the blade, they wipe it on the blade. They'll have some sort of a wick attached to a little reservoir of diesel. And the wick is like a big piece of felt, basically. And it just rubs a film of diesel on that blade through like a capillary action. And that's all it takes. And it works great. So, if you have that type of mill with all metal transmission between the wheels and the blade, diesel is a really good economical alternative, and it's going to cut down on your friction. It's going to do everything a lubricant should. But for Woodland Mills, I would strongly advise against using anything like diesel. I think you want to stick to water, windshield washer fluid, or some type of soap water mix. A lot of people swear by Pine Sol. Put a couple shots of Pine Sol in with water, and Pine Sol really cuts through pine sap very well. It's great if you have to clean up clothing, by the way, that you've got pine sap on, which happens a lot to me. But you mix a little bit of Pine Sol in with your water, and it's going to really help cut through the pitch and the sap in pine trees, and it's still going to be a very environmentally friendly alternative to using something like diesel. So, the summary to me is absolutely you should use lubricant. For these types of mills, for Woodland Mills, I'd make sure it's something that's water-based, and you should be fine. Now, in earlier video I made probably sometime last year when I was talking about tracking problems, I mentioned a lot of people have problems with their blade jumping off, and the reason is because they're running too much lubricant, and they're sending so much lubricant through the cut that there's still a very noticeable amount on the other side of the cut. It gets on the drive belt, makes the drive belt slippery, and then your blade can walk right off even if your tracking is set fine. So that's one caution that still applies here. And I think in that video I said this is not a car wash. You don't want to be making bubbles and suds. You don't want to be water to be slinging off wheels here. You really want a minimal amount of lubricant. All that lubricant has to do is put a film on the blade as it passes through the cut. Beyond that, it's not important anymore, and having too much of it can actually be detrimental. So again, when you're setting your lubricant rate, you want to see finite drips. maybe 1 or 2 drips per second. And you can actually work through the math and figure out the blade speed and how much you want to get on the blade. But you really should be seeing finite drips coming down on the blade, and that's really all you need. It does not have to be any more than that. So don't turn it on like a hose. Don't shoot it out like a stream. Get these small controlled drips, and that's really an ideal balance between lubrication and everything else that matters on the sawmill. Now, one last thing I wanted to talk about, which is interesting to me. If most of us, I think, are sawing green logs, stuff that's been freshly cut within days or weeks of putting it on the sawmill, and it turns out, depending on the species of wood, there may already be enough water inside of that wood to act as your lubricant. And you might want to take that into account. So I just went and did some math for yellow pine, which is what I saw primarily out here. By weight, when it's fresh cut green, yellow pine is 48% water. Okay, that's by weight. 52% of the weight is from the wood. Volumetrically, there's a smaller amount of water because water's heavier, so it takes much less water to equal the weight of the wood. But there's however you want to slice the math up, there's an insane amount of water and moisture inside a green pine log, and that's going to further reduce your dependence on lubrication. And so to me, it's entirely conceivable that if you're milling a fresh cut pine log, you might not need to run any lubricant at all, or you might need to run just a very, very small amount, just enough to offset any stickiness from pitch or sap in the wood. On the other hand, if you're cutting old dry lumber, and I don't think that's as common, but I know some people do it. Now you're in a situation where it's going to be a lot more critical to add the lubricant because there's hardly any moisture in that wood. To lubricate the blade, to keep it cool, to have a film of moisture on the blade, it's going to come down to what you're adding in your lubricant system, because there's not going to be a whole lot in the wood, or there might be none in the wood for you to rely on. And so those are two extremes, between green logs and older, drier logs. You need to think about lubricant in that balance as well. Certainly, if you're cutting dry logs, crank up the lubricant, because it's going to be much, much more important there. So anyways, I think that'll cover everything I wanted to talk about today. Again, I thought this was a real interesting topic when I saw it on that Facebook group. I thought it'd make for a great video, and I hope it's been useful for everyone. Thanks for watching.